Welcome everyone to my talk on retrocomputing as inspiration for designing games. My name is Wilfried Elmenreich. I'm from the University of Klagenfurt and I'm very happy to be here at the conference. Of course, since it is virtual, I would be even more happier if we could all meet in person, but still I think this is a very good opportunity to talk about media, arts, design and AI in this context. So, first, I want to address what is retrocomputing. So it is, as the name implies, it is the use of old computer systems in modern times. So this is different from just using retro-style graphics in a state-of-the-art system. So as we see today in many games, there are sometimes pixelated graphics used, but retrocomputing is more than that. Retrocomputing really means that you are going to use the old systems. That means you have to stick to simpler graphics. You are restricted what you can do in sound, in memory, everything. And this all sounds like a burden, but it also means that you can focus more on the essentials of your game. Just to give an example for platform, the probably most well-known platform for retrocomputing is the Commodore C64. It's a very old computer. It entered the market 1982, so this is almost 40 years ago. But actually, it was produced quite over more than a decade. So this is probably unimaginable for a computer system today, that something that is introduced in the beginning of a decade, that it is still produced and sold after more than 10 years. So at that time, it was really a very great computer. It still is. But of course, if you look at the specs, they are not entirely overwhelming. So for example, the CPU is 1 megahertz. Today we measure CPU speed in gigahertz. And also there is no floating point unit. So this means calculations where you need floating points, they take really quite a long time if you, for example, if you're doing 3D graphics or stuff like this. The computer has 64 kilobytes of RAM. This also doesn't sound like that it is a lot, but actually the RAM was quite an asset of this computer. So with 64 kilobytes of RAM, you have to consider that all the graphics and sound files, they're typically much smaller than we are used today. Of course, if we are taking a photo with our smartphone, it has like a couple of megabytes already. But if you have low resolution and low color images, then 64 kilobytes of RAM is quite a good deal to work with. So already spoke about it. The resolution, the maximum resolution is 320 times 200 pixels. There are 16 colors, but in many pictures you don't have all of them available, so even more restricted. The text characters, they are represented in 8 times 8 pixel characters, and you have a display that has 40 characters width times 25 lines. So you can basically show like 1000 characters at once. It also has 8 sprites where you can move some figures around, but the sprites are also rather tiny. And for music, it has a synthesizer. It's the legendary SID chip that is used by some artists even today to make synthesizer sounds. But it's also with the 3 channels, it's quite limited. And so you have to think of many tricks to get your music to play with more than 3 voices. Well, and the Commodore 64 is one of those computers where you don't have a problem, or you like it if there is a blue screen, because it has this blue color design when you start it up. So this is the blue screen we all like. So what kind of games can be made on such a system? So the short answer is basically everything. So you can make all kind of games, but probably best known are these platform action games where you run around. So on the left side you see Janus Sisters. This was quite a controversy because it looked so similar to Mario Brothers. But what's interesting is one of the first games that had a female character as the main protagonist. In the middle there is Ghosts and Goblins, a game that was really hard to play. So basically a player like me never could finish this game. And on the right side there is the game Bruce Lee, which also shows another interesting detail of that time. So Bruce Lee here, you know, Bruce Lee is an Asian martial arts fighter, and he's depicted with without a shirt, and they used yellow to depict his skin color, which kind of was, or unfortunately probably still is, kind of a stereotype for Asian people. In a newer version of the game, it was changed to a more fitting skin color. But these are these kind of action arcade games. But there are other games that you can make with this computer and then have been made. So we're looking here at some games that are more based on text or story. They have a more slower gameplay, so you have a more decelerated approach. On the left side there is a point-and-click adventure named Zack McCracken. In the middle there is the port of the game Zork, a famous text adventure to the Commodore 64. And on the right side you see some screenshots from the game Alter Ego, which was an interesting game because there you had to take decisions, and these decisions led to different developments in your life. So you played from childhood on until the end of your life and made decisions which then let your life go into different directions. Very interesting concept. And for example, apart from a way that you have to store the text somehow, such a game does not require excellent graphics or very high processing speed. So games, it's possible to make very interesting, very good games without actually requiring this most state-of-the-art latest computer or game console. And when we have a look on modern productions, so yes, there are still games produced for the Commodore 64, also for other retro platforms. I just used the Commodore 64 as an example, and also because I'm a big fan of this system. And for example, if you look back in 2019, so last year, there were more than 100 games made and published for this platform. So most of these games were indie games. There are not many commercial games, but there are some. And they encompass all different kinds of genres. So on the left side, we see Fix-It Felix Jr., which is a game adaptation from a movie. In the middle, we see a screenshot from the game Alice Escape from Wonderland, which is a walk and click adventure, so quite similar to these point and click adventures. And on the right side, we see Space Moguls, which is a game where you try to develop. It's like a board game, but it's modeled as a computer game. So all quite interesting games, and all these games, they are fun to play even today. They are just different from the games that we are probably used to when we are going for the newest releases on Steam or other platforms. What's interesting also in the context of AI is what is under the hood. So how are these games made? So one observation is that almost all games for these platforms nowadays are cross-developed. And there are modern graphic algorithms used for best conversion of a graphical image to the low resolution restricted computer system. There is an excessive use of data compression because memory, 64 kilobyte was a lot of memory back then, but today we really need to to get out of this memory what is possible. So there are algorithms running in these games, compressing data, uncompressing data all the time, and you have to consider that we also have a severe restriction on processing power, and data compression usually needs a lot of processing power. So these algorithms have to implement it quite smartly in order to make them run so that all the necessary game data is produced in time. And then there is a very interesting approach, which is procedural generation of game content, which basically means that you have some kind of formula that generates your entire game world, or at least parts of it. And all in all, we can say the games made today for retro platforms, they employ recent results from computer graphics, from signal processing, from mathematics, and so on, in order to make these games as good as possible and to get like the most out of it. And just for a couple of examples. So an example for how to deal with memory restrictions is very nicely given by the game Minima. So Minima is an Ultima-like game. So Ultima was a famous series of role-playing games that where you had a large game world, and you could interact with different characters in the game world, and you had to solve some problem of this world. And also in Minima, you run around in a large map. I did the calculations. It's around 4,000 times 1,600 pixels. So basically something that would even exceed a 4K display by a couple of pixels. So this is the size of the game map. And please consider Commodore C64 only has 64 kilobyte of memory and only 300 times 200 pixels that can be displayed at once. So it's using scrolling to show to show only a part of the game world. So you get the impression that the world is huge. You run around in this world and you get the impression that you're really in a large world. You have to fight monsters there. You can also restock and rest in villages. You can visit the king in a castle. There are different music sequences implemented, and the goal is to find 8 items on this map and to bring them to the king. Another question is, what do you think? How large is this game? It's running on a Commodore 64, but probably before it is loaded, it's probably not using all the memory, or does it? What would you think? Probably might not have guessed it, because it's only 2 kilobyte of memory if the game is saved on disk. So when the game is loaded, it only uses 2 kilobyte of memory, and then when the game is started, it uses procedural content generation to generate the map. So basically it expands in the memory in order to generate all the content of the game, but initially it's just 2 kilobytes of disk memory. The game is well playable. I played it through. It is enjoyable, and it's probably the best value per byte ever that has been seen in a computer game. It was the winner of a mini-game competition that took place in 2001. So at the time when the Commodore 64 was not produced anymore for almost a decade already. So it was already a retrocomputing event, and there were a number of games submitted there, and Minima won the 2K competition, I think for a good reason. Another example, how to deal with graphical restrictions, is given by the game Digiloy. So Digiloy also goes a step back and uses even less capabilities of the target system that would be there, because it uses only pre-made block graphics. On Commodore 64 you have a char set that has a number of block graphics. You can see it in the editor showing the available characters in the bottom of the slide. You see the characters here. There are, in this character set, there are only uppercase characters, by the way. And then there is a number of graphical characters, like different kind of blocks and shapes, but not so many after all. And people are trying to like build the best possible graphics by just using these block graphics as kind of an art form. So you see this clown on the left side, that was drawn just with this block graphics, and then using just the 16 available colors. You also see them here. And it's comparable with the ASCII art we have on PC. But the block graphics actually, they have a number of characters that are actually a little bit better suited, so you can make really interesting graphics there. And on the right side you see some screenshots from the game Digiloy. So it's not using any sprites, it's not using any pixelated graphics, but it's only using these pre-made block graphics in combination with a clever selection of colors. And that way a game was made that has graphics that are definitely comparable with other productions for this system. So by even restricting yourself further, you can sometimes come up with very innovative ideas and very interesting results. So we have different art forms. We have the usage of computer science algorithms in order to make these kind of things. And now probably is the time where you would say, okay, you probably convinced me, or at least I will give it a try. I would like to look at some games for inspiration. Is there a place where I can find them? And for this reason I provided you this list. So a good place to start with would be the Commodore 64 scene database, where basically all productions for the Commodore 64 are archived, and there is a section on games, and there you'll find all kind of games. There is also the webpage of Protovision games. They are selling games. So this is also an example how people even today can make commercial games and sell commercial games for the Commodore C64. The website Pue provides not only productions for the Commodore 64 or for Commodore computers, but for different kind of retro computers. So this is probably a very good point to go to in order to see results for different systems. And there are different YouTube channels, but one that has an interesting list of new games for Commodore 64, new games for Commodore Amiga for each year is the Retrocomputing channel, and there they are also doing plays. So it is not difficult to download a game from the Commodore C64 scene database and to run it in an emulator. But if you don't want to do this, you can also go to this YouTube channel and basically get the main aspects of a game presented to you. So now for my takeaway message. Retro platforms require definitely a different art and music style. So you have to work differently in order to make a game there. And you have to plan the set of features that you want to use quite well. So you cannot just throw in everything first and and then have a look at the game. But you really have to think what you want to use, how much memory, how does it cost you, how much processing power does it cost you, and which features are more important at the beginning of the game. So you don't want to just put a video sequence at the beginning of a game, even if it would be technically possible to do something like this, but it would require too much memory probably. It is using old platforms, but there is the use of smart algorithms. So probably by studying the algorithms used in these productions, we can learn a lot, even for games that are not meant to run on retro platforms. So for example, how to use data compression in a smart way, how to use procedural content generation, and what is done for graphics and sound pre-processing. So probably sometimes limiting your resolution or limiting your possibilities you have with graphics could lead to a very interesting result that makes your game in overall more interesting for the people to play it. And these restrictions lead you to a different kind of game. And there is an advantage and a disadvantage. So there is no large commercial market for this kind of retro games, which if you want to live off it would be a disadvantage. But on the other hand, the advantage is that it is basically a place for people who are making games for themselves and not for a market, which also leads to sometimes more diverse and more interesting results. So this leads me to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening and enjoy the retro platforms.